Hello there. So today we're going to be talking about putting a date on the origins of the Haudenosaunee confederacy, whether that's even possible, and some of the attempts that people have made to do such a task. I guess we'll get started then. So the first thing is that I think you could do all the archaeology in the world, you could do all the history work in the world, and you wouldn't arrive at a concrete date. I don't think that's a feasible objective. The simple reason of that is we don't have written histories to work with from the period. Written histories are really good at concrete dates and stuff like that. What we do have, archaeology and oral histories, are both useless for that sort of stuff. Oral histories are really bad at sort of concrete dates and stuff, whereas archaeology is just useless for telling us anything sort of social and floaty. Archaeology is bad at preserving relationships. Some people have attempted to use archaeology to sort of try and guess at the origins of the Confederacy. They've done this by looking at, here's where trade seems to have increased. In this particular era, we find a lot more Seneca pottery in Mohawk territory and Mohawk pottery in Seneca territory relative to earlier eras. Now, that could be an indication of a confederacy, but it could also just be an indication of a trade agreement or just generally friendly relationships. Canada does a lot of trade with China. That doesn't mean Canada and China are part of some confederacy. It doesn't mean we have any sort of shared political organization. So that stuff it could be interesting or it could be bunk, and we don't get to know which it is. And so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. Among sort of indigenous historians, indigenous people kind of know a thing or two. I think my understanding is that the general consensus is that it's about 1,000 years old. You do find some people who think it's older. 1,000 years, that's ridiculous. It's clearly older than that. It's got to be at least 1,600 years old. Probably more than that even. I don't think that's a standard position. I don't think that's the majority position. So among Euro historians, there isn't a consensus. There's, I think, maybe 4 or 5 sort of standard dates and standard ranges that people put forward. So what sort of tools can we use to maybe get an idea of the origin? I've already said archaeology isn't too much use. It generally doesn't tell us anything too interesting without context provided by history and stuff. Archaeology by itself is not much use, I don't think. Oral histories have got their issues. So some people really don't like oral histories. And so you get some people talking about, we're going to come up with the date of the origins of the Iroquois Confederacy, and we're not going to use any oral history stuff. That's all nonsense. We're going to do it just archaeologically. And to put it bluntly, I kind of think those people are idiots who don't understand how archaeology works. Oral history's got some issues, but it just requires different methodology to sort of dig through. And there are sort of indigenous historians doing that work. They collect a bunch of different versions of the same story, and they sort of compare and contrast them. Okay, this one's got all of these ridiculous details. It's talked about unicorns and giants and mummies and stuff like that, so we probably shouldn't pay this version very much credence, whereas this version has got very little fantastical. And here's where the two versions align, and so on, so on, so on. And here are these two versions that are not fantastical. We can probably a little bit more trustworthy than the other versions. And they both include these details, and they both exclude these details, which are common in other versions. But one of them has this detail and the other one doesn't. Okay, what do we think about that? And so on, so on, so on. In short, it's historian work. You can apply historian practice to oral histories. You just have to think about them a little bit differently. This, that, and the other thing. It can tell us certain things with a fair degree of reliability. You just have to know what you're doing in analyzing them, so on, so on, so on. You have to look at each detail sort of critically and with sort of scrutiny. So I've talked about this previously in talking about, like, basically criticizing the accounts of the Jesuits and stuff like that. Everybody's got an agenda, basically. The Jesuits, they got their agenda in sort of demonizing stuff like that, demonizing all those Indians so that they can get motivation, get support for missionary activities and stuff like that. Oh, these people are living in squalor and filth and worshiping devils. We got to get in there and save their souls. Stuff like that. Now, any sort of national mythology has the sort of objectives of, well, nationalism, to put it bluntly. So you get the American folk versions of their national mythology. They're going to big up all of this stuff like, oh, George Washington, he's the best. He's this really great guy and all this, that, and the other stuff. And they're going to downplay the stuff like, oh, well, actually the revolution was started because the King George he wanted to stop Americans from pilfering Indian land. Right? People don't generally play up that angle of their folk history. Now, this gives us sort of an opportunity, though, in that stuff that's good, if it's sort of self-reported, isn't necessarily reliable. It could just be people bigging themselves up. But stuff that's negative, stuff that doesn't paint you in that great of a light, if it's self-reported, that's a lot more reliable. So stuff like, we think about like the founding of Rome. Romulus and Remus, they're raised by a wolf. I think that's bunk. It's probably just thrown in there to make people sound cool. Yeah, our guys were so cool, they were raised by wolves. Even if they were really raised by wolves, they probably wouldn't have been in any kind of state to found a city. You think about there have been people who've been raised by animals in the jungle or wherever, and when they come out at the age of 10 or wherever, re-enter society, they're kind of non-functional. They can't talk and they don't think about things the way humans think about things, and they just don't ever really adapt or recover from that. That stuff is just bunk, just thrown in there to make the Romans sound really cool. Other stuff, like Romulus murdering Remus, or the rape of the Sabine women, that stuff does not make Rome sound good. That is not a sort of, glamorous thing to include in your founding myth, which makes me suggest that might actually be real. Same with other stuff like Jesus. Jesus, he was a virgin birth. Right? That's just nonsense to make him sound mystical. But Jesus' last words being, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? That does not sound like the words of a pious man, which suggests to me that those might really be the real Jesus' last words. Right? They're very sort of human and weak, and this, that, and the other thing, so on, so on, so on. So we go to the founding of the Iroquois confederacy. Every version I've encountered of the story either has Daganoweda being a Huron, a stutterer, or most often both. None of these are sort of good things. Yeah, the founder of our confederacy, he wasn't one of us. He was some guy from our enemy nation. It's like if the national hero of England was actually a Frenchman and was well known to be a Frenchman. It's bizarre. Similarly, the stuttering thing. He's supposed to stutter so badly or have such a foreign... He's either supposed to stutter so badly or have such a strong foreign accent that it makes communication really difficult for him. He can't really present his ideas on his own. That's interesting as well. It's not exactly painting him in a sort of glorious light. It's painting him as sort of weak and frail and fallible, which suggests to me that one of those two things, or both of them, are true. He either stuttered really badly, or was a foreigner, or was both. This, that, and the other thing. Similarly, sort of Hiawatha. In most versions, he's lost his family and he's now living in the woods. In some versions as a murderer, in some versions as a cannibal. Now, this is not a very sort of glorious way to paint your founding figure, your national hero. Oh, our national hero, he was a cannibal. So on, so on, so on. That's weird. Stuff like that, though, can have you can have this sort of negative stuff and have it still be sort of, I don't know, maybe propagandistic is the wrong word, maybe like moralistic. Romulus and Remus, it could be there to show the duality of man, something like that, some moral parable. And Jesus, God, my God, why have you forsaken me? That could be there to emphasize his humanity. He's not just this divinely perfect being, he's a human, and even humans have moments of weakness and doubt and such. Oh, like even Jesus doubted at the last moment. You're allowed to doubt just so long as you keep coming back to the faith and stuff like that. True faith without doubt is not faith. I don't know. I don't know how Christians think. And similarly, sort of Hiawatha being a cannibal. Some icon of redemption, maybe. I don't know. Even the worst of us can recover and do something great and memorable and meaningful. And so on, so on, so on. Where do I go from here? Give me a second to think. It's hard talking and walking at the same time, you know? It's hard talking, thinking, and walking. I get tired doing this. I'm generally pretty fit, but like I get out of breath when I'm walking and talking. Okay, so let's get back into it. So is there anything from the oral histories that can help us date the origins of the Iroquois Confederacy? There kind of has to be, right? Because if there isn't, then we've got no sort of context for anything historical, anything archaeological. I've already talked about archaeology is useless without context provided by histories. So if we want to find any kind of origin, we have to look through the oral histories. It's not going to be anywhere else. So what is there in the oral histories that could help us put a date to this, or a range of dates? Bloody airplanes. They should all be destroyed. Anyway, what the heck? If man was meant to be in the sky, he would have been born with wings. Abominations. Round them all up. I don't know, I'm just talking garbage. Anyway, what the heck was I even saying? Okay, so what is there in the oral histories that could be potentially useful for giving us a date or a date range? So I talked about previously this paper called A Sign in the Sky, which attempted to use eclipses to put a more concrete date on the founding of the Confederacy. This is bunk. The eclipse versions of the story, those belong to the miracle categories of the stories, where he does all of these, he wins people's support through all of these fabulous miracles, like Jesus turning fish into wine and stuff like that. Those versions are generally not useful or reliable. They're not the stuff of which the miracles at least, are not the stuff of which a real history is going to be built. The eclipse detail is not part of versions that indigenous historians tend to work with. I think we might also have the origin of it. We might know where that detail originates. It might be like a collection of Indian stories from the mid-1800s. So the eclipse is just bunk. That is not going to be a useful tool for identifying the origins of the Confederacy. It's just bunk. I think the appeal of the eclipse is that it gives us something concrete. We can say it happened at around this specific date in history. And there's basically nothing else throughout the stories that gives us anything like that. So another thing in that paper, if I remember correctly, they attempted to sort of validate their method by validate their idea using a different method. Always good practice. And what they did was they took the number of people who've served as head of the Grand Council, the Tadadaho, and then they compared that to sort of time in office for other historical positions, I think like kings and stuff. So here's what the average reign of a European king was, and here's what we get if we take that average and put it onto this number of people who've held this position. I think the number was like 146, something like that. I don't remember. And we know sort of broadly how many there have been because that's a very easy number to keep track of. Oral histories aren't great at a lot of things, but this is something that's very easy. You're all doing sort of a similar version of this. I ask you how old you are. You don't have to do a calculation. Okay, I was born in 1995 and that makes me to, okay, 2005. It's 2025 now, so that means that I'm like, I don't know, I guess I'm 30? Holy heck, I'm 30? Oh my God, that's disgusting. Anyway, you don't have to do that sort of calculation. You just know how old you are because you've been keeping count. That number, which they provide, like 146, that's potentially very reliable. Probably there's a couple of mistakes, but there wouldn't be that many. If that number comes from a reliable place, I'm not sure. If that number came from some book that they read, then I don't put any sort of weight behind it. If it comes from, people actually involved with the Grand Council, I would put a lot of weight in it. So they took that and compared the number to get sort of a ballpark origin of the Confederacy. Now, I thought I could come up with a better number. So I took the average pontificate of the early popes, the 146th first popes. I figured this would be a better comparison than kings because kings sometimes get on the throne really bloody young, and thus they can have a 70-year reign and stuff like that, which would skew things in the wrong direction. Whereas sort of a pope, they're mostly getting it as old men or middle-aged men. Similarly to Taradaho. We don't know what the average sort of age of people getting the position is, but the average age of people getting it for the last 3 or 4 or 5 has been people in their 40s. Men who've got some experience, but they're not so old that they're sort of rigid and set and can't adapt. They've still got some dynamism left in them, but they've got some experience. People in their 40s are ideal. A lot of the early popes met bad ends. They were martyred by the Romans. They lived in an era of persecution, which I figured would be a decent enough stand-in for sort of the colonial era. A lot of people dying of disease or getting their villages burned or getting killed by scalp hunters or whatever, and so on, so on, so on. So I did that, and it put me back a certain amount of time, which I don't think is very important. It gives us a data point, it gives us an idea. It doesn't give us anything concrete because we don't actually know what the average is. We're just doing a comparison because it might be interesting. We don't know what the average was. The most recent two, they've had an average time in office of like 30 years. Okay, now is that typical or atypical? We don't get to know. And so on, so on, so on. So this sort of methodology can only tell us sort of what's broadly plausible. It can't tell us what is. My using this, I don't think it's at all plausible for the date to be younger than 1400. I think that would make the average time in office way too bloody short to make any sense. And so on, so on, so on, so on, so on.
Hello, this is Editing Malcolm. I want to sort of interrupt this and inject a sort of tangent that probably isn't quite a tangent. I should have thought of this at the time. So we can use this sort of method to give us sort of a approximate estimate for the youngest it could possibly be. Archaeology can tell us a sort of approximate estimate for the oldest it could possibly be. It can sort of tell us when the material culture coalesced into something that we would recognize now. So the earliest corn or evidence of corn that we have in the Iroquoian region comes from, I think, the mid-800s. Probably earlier than that. We probably haven't found the first piece of corn introduced to the region, but sort of a ballpark. 800 and something is the earliest that we know about. It wasn't until the adoption of corn that people started to become sort of properly sedentary, living in a site for years on end. Before that, they'd plant, but then they'd move on following the deer herds, come back to this site in fall when it was harvest time, just leave the beans and squash to grow on their own over the summer, hope for the best, and don't really count on them. So the proper sedentarism doesn't really occur until after the 800s. I forget when longhouses, as we recognize them, appear. It might be like, I don't know, 1,000? Something like that. Before that, they're not longhouses, they're just houses. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that archaeology gives us sort of an uppermost limit. It's unlikely that the Confederacy is older than 1,200 years, 1,300 years, maybe at the tops. Another angle that's worth a short tangent is linguistic archaeology. I don't put a lot of stock in the sort of linguistic reconstruction type field. I think a lot of that is at best misunderstood and occasionally just pseudoscience. But one thing that's interesting is that the linguistic type people, they estimate that the Tuscarora split off from the Iroquois proper around Lake Ontario. They split off about 1,000 years ago. Again, I don't put a lot of weight in the linguistic reconstruction type field, but I think someone could potentially use this as a data point in an argument to put the date of the Confederacy at something like 1,000 years ago. But I'm not going to give that any more time. Back to the video proper.
Okay. If that can't tell us anything concrete either, are there any sort of reliable details from the stories could potentially give us something to work with here? Watch my step, watch my step. Holy heck, it's pretty here. So the first one is an omission. None of the stories, except for, I think, the Handsome Lake version, none of the versions of the Peacemaker story have got Europeans. There's not Europeans running around the backgrounds of the stories causing all kinds of trouble. Nobody's shooting each other with muskets. There's none of that stuff happening. The Europeans are completely absent from every version of the story except for a couple of them which are identifiably late versions of the story. And in those ones, there's something that's happening in the future. Handsome Lake version of the story, there are Europeans, but the Europeans are sort of a prophecy that's going to happen. It's not something that has already happened or is currently happening. Stuff like that. So there's no Europeans in the story, which tells me, because Europeans were a bloody significant event, if there were Europeans running around in the background causing trouble, they would be in the story. It tells me that this happened before them. How much before them is open to debate. It could very plausibly have been only a generation or so, but it had to have happened before them, otherwise they'd be in the stories. Sort of the meme, the sort of racist meme, oh, all these Indians love to blame their troubles on white people. That'd be such an easy sort of scapegoat for the story. The start of the story, everything's awful. It's this period of constant bloodshed and warfare, and everybody's at each other's throats all the time. It'd be so bloody easy to just stick Europeans in there and say, yeah, the Europeans were causing all this trouble, so we formed this confederacy. Stuff like that. That they're not in there tells me that they weren't in the real version of the story. So there's not a ton of other sort of potentially useful details that I could think of, but there's two. At the start of the story, it's bloody awful. It's just carnage. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are just running rampant. Everybody's dying, there's constant war, there's famine, there's disease. Everything sucks, and it's all awful, and everybody's gonna die, and this is just horrible. That's the start of the story. And then at the end of the story, there's this golden age of peace and prosperity and tranquility and stuff like that, which lasts at least one generation. It might not necessarily last it might not last very long. I read one version where there was sort of trouble not too long after that, but there's at least a brief period of peace and good times.
Another quick tangent. This is one of the details that makes me really opposed to any sort of 1600s date, because basically the whole 1600s were anything but peaceful. They were basically a century of constant bloodshed and awfulness. We know that the 1600s were dramatically worse than what was before because 80% population reductions are not normal.
Okay, those are the two details that appear every version of the story that I've encountered. It sucks before it and it's better after it. Now, I think this could potentially be usable. This is such a vague and general sort of thing that it's probably not useful, but I think there's the potential for it to be useful. So there's this famous massacre that occurred, the Crow Creek Massacre. This occurred out in Dakota or wherever. I forget which one of them. Doesn't matter. It's all Yank territory. It's all the same. It occurred somewhere out in western Yank territory. People sort of analyzing the bones, they find that these people were suffering all sorts of malnutrition-related ailments. They were a couple of inches shorter than their genetic ancestors and their genetic descendants. As well, they had all sorts of, like their bones were deformed from lack of certain nutrients and stuff like that, lack of food. They had these people were in rough shape. And so it was sort of hypothesized that they'd been living in a multiple decade long famine, possibly as a result of like a multi-decade long drought, which could explain why it was so brutal during the Crow Creek Massacre. If your neighbors come raiding you for food and there's no food to go around, basically, that could explain why they're not taking any prisoners, or why they're not taking many prisoners. Because like if there's not enough food to go around, you don't want to be feeding all these people if you're raiding for food. And you maybe also don't want to leave people alive if you're raiding for food in this sort of existential climate, because now they don't have any food. They're just going to come and raid you and try and get that food back, because if they don't, they're just going to die and stuff like that. And I forget what the name of the bloody paper was called, but somebody did like dendrochronology, which is they looked at tree growth rings to try and identify periods of drought. And they sort of found one that was broadly contemporary with the Crow Creek Massacre. And yeah, they were living in a 20-year-long drought. And so on, so on, so on. And I sort of wonder if someone could do that over here. Try and find all of these periods of prolonged drought throughout the history of the sort of Eastern Great Lakes region. Try and find all of these periods of drought and then try and sort of cross-reference them with archaeology and the versions of the story and stuff, and say, okay, here's an era in which there was a prolonged drought and villages become more fortified, and so on, so on, so on. And that could be potentially used as like the starting date. So I think that's a potentially interesting line of inquiry. I think somebody could do something there. And again, it wouldn't give us the actual date of the thing. It would give us sort of a ballpark. It happens somewhere in the vicinity of this event, sometime after this drought or in the middle of this drought. It could potentially have happened a long time after that drought. Right, the drought's a catalyst which sparks lots of sort of a cycle of violence, and so on, so on, so on. Anyway. Wouldn't it be weird? Okay, here's an angle. Here's an angle. Wouldn't it be bloody weird if you were to do that dendrochronology thing and find that the same drought which provoked the Crow Creek Massacre also provoked like the foundation of the Iroquois confederacy? Like the bad times out of which the confederacy formed was the same bad times that provoked the Crow Creek Massacre? Wouldn't that be? It's probably, that's definitely sort of grasping at straws and stuff and big reaches, but like, wouldn't that, like, anyway. I've sort of been rambling and waffling for a long time, so I guess I'm just gonna leave off. So like, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. I hope you found this interesting. I know it's not very well sort of structured or anything like that. Just sort of broad conclusions. I don't think anybody's gonna get anything specific. Like, 1,000 years, yeah, that's plausible enough. Oh, 700 years, yeah, that's plausible enough. Oh, 1,200 years, yeah, whatever, I don't care. Stuff like that. Post-contact dates are dumb. People put them forward are dumb too. Anyway, anyway, I'm just rambling at this point, so I'm going to call it short. Thank you for listening.